The world knew Eddie Van Halen as the man who redefined what six strings could do. His fingers moved across the fretboard like lightning captured in human form, creating sounds that seemed to defy the laws of physics. And then there was Lou Reed, the poet who wielded three chords like weapons, who believed that simplicity could cut deeper than any technical flourish. Two philosophies, two egos, one backstage room at the 1984 MTV Video Music Awards. What happened in those 7 minutes would haunt Eddie Van Halen for the next 20 years of his life, and the words Lou Reed spoke would echo in his mind until the very end. But before we dive into that September night in New York City, if you want to hear more untold stories from rock history's most controversial moments, hit that subscribe button. To understand what happened backstage that night, you need to understand the seismic divide between Eddie Van Halen's world and Lou Reed's world in 1984. Eddie was riding the highest wave of his career. His guitar solo on Michael Jackson's Beat It had just introduced him to millions who had never heard of Van Halen. MTV was playing Jump on endless rotation. The band had conquered arenas. Eddie had become the guitarist every kid in America wanted to be, the man who made tapping a household technique, who turned the guitar into an extension of pure adrenaline. He was 30 years old and felt invincible. Lou Reed, on the other hand, represented everything Eddie's generation had supposedly moved past. At 42, Lou was the godfather of punk, the architect of the Velvet Underground, the man who had written Heroin and Walk on the Wild Side when Eddie was still learning his first scales. But Lou didn't shred. He didn't tap. He didn't play blazing solos that made audiences lose their minds. He played simple, almost primitive guitar parts, often just droning on 2 or 3 chords, while his lyrics did the heavy lifting. To the MTV generation, Lou Reed was an artifact from a darker, slower, less spectacular era. To Lou, the MTV generation represented everything that was wrong with rock and roll: spectacle over substance, technique over truth, entertainment over art. The 1984 MTV Video Music Awards brought these two worlds into the same building, the same hallway, and eventually the same room. Eddie was there because Van Halen was nominated for Best Stage Performance for Jump. Lou was there because he had just released New Sensations, an album that was his attempt to prove he could still matter in the MTV era, even though every fiber of his being resisted what MTV stood for. Both men had been drinking. Both men were surrounded by handlers and hangers-on who fed their egos. And both men were about to have a conversation that neither would ever forget. The moment, backstage at Radio City Music Hall. The green room backstage at Radio City Music Hall was packed with rock royalty that night. Madonna was holding court in one corner. Prince was somewhere in the building but refused to mingle. Tina Turner was fresh off her comeback. And in a back hallway, away from the main chaos, Eddie Van Halen found himself face-to-face with Lou Reed. According to the 3 people who witnessed what happened, the encounter started casually enough. Eddie, who had been drinking Jack Daniels since the afternoon, recognized Lou and approached him. Eddie was a fan of the Velvet Underground, had grown up listening to White Light, White Heat, and genuinely respected what Lou had done in the 60s. But Eddie was also drunk, and when Eddie was drunk, the filter between his brain and his mouth disappeared. What Eddie said next would become the match that lit the fuse. He looked at Lou, smiled, and said something along the lines of, "You know, Lou, you're a great songwriter, man. But you don't really play guitar, do you? I mean, not really." The room went silent. Lou Reed, who had been holding a plastic cup of wine, stopped mid-sip. His eyes, hidden behind his signature dark sunglasses even indoors, locked onto Eddie. One of the witnesses later described the moment as watching a cobra decide whether to strike. Lou didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. Instead, he set down his cup, removed his sunglasses, and looked directly at Eddie with those pale, unsettling eyes that had stared down Andy Warhol, David Bowie, and every music critic who had ever dismissed him. What Lou Reed said next lasted less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds carved themselves into Eddie Van Halen's psyche like acid etching glass. According to the most reliable account, from a sound engineer who was standing close enough to hear every word, Lou spoke slowly and deliberately. "Eddie," he said, "you play guitar like you're trying to prove something to your father. I play guitar like I already killed mine." He paused, let that sink in, then continued. "You know how many notes I need to make someone feel something? 3. You know how many notes you need? All of them. That's not skill, kid. That's fear. You're afraid that if you stop moving your fingers, people might actually have to listen to what you're trying to say. And here's the thing. Here's the part that's going to keep you up at night. You don't have anything to say. You're just noise. Beautiful, impressive, technically flawless noise. But when you're gone, when your fingers can't move like that anymore, what's left? I'll tell you what's left. Nothing." The hallway was frozen. Nobody moved. Eddie's face went through a series of transformations, from confusion to anger to something that looked like he had been punched in the stomach. He opened his mouth to respond, but Lou wasn't finished. "I don't need to play guitar like you," Lou said, putting his sunglasses back on, "because I'm not trying to distract people from the fact that I have nothing important to say. You keep playing fast, Eddie. Play faster. Maybe one day you'll outrun that feeling that you're just a circus act in spandex." And with that, Lou Reed picked up his wine, turned, and walked away, leaving Eddie Van Halen standing in that hallway with his mouth open and his ego shattered. But here's where the story gets even more painful. Eddie didn't explode. He didn't chase after Lou. He didn't defend himself or fire back with his own insult. Instead, according to the witness accounts, Eddie just stood there for a moment, then quietly excused himself and disappeared into a nearby dressing room. What happened in that dressing room over the next 20 minutes would only come to light years later. Van Halen's road manager, Noel Monk, found Eddie sitting on the floor of the dressing room with his back against the wall, his head in his hands. Eddie was crying. Not the angry, frustrated tears of someone who had been insulted, but the deep, heaving sobs of someone who had just been forced to confront a truth they had spent years avoiding. Monk, who had seen Eddie drunk countless times, who had seen him destroy hotel rooms and get into fights, said he had never seen Eddie like this. When Monk asked what happened, Eddie could barely get the words out. "He's right," Eddie kept saying. "He's fucking right. What am I even doing? What am I trying to say?" Monk tried to calm him down, told him Lou was just a bitter old man, told him that Eddie Van Halen had revolutionized guitar and didn't need to justify himself to anyone. But Eddie wasn't hearing it. He kept spiraling, kept talking about how he had spent his entire life trying to be the best guitarist in the world, but had never stopped to ask himself why. He talked about his father, a classically trained musician who had always looked down on rock and roll, who had died a few years earlier without ever really understanding what Eddie did or why it mattered. He talked about feeling like a fraud, like someone who had perfected a magic trick but forgotten that magic was supposed to mean something. Eventually, Monk got Eddie cleaned up enough to go back out, but something had shifted. For the rest of the night, Eddie was quiet, withdrawn. He didn't celebrate when Van Halen won their award. He barely spoke to anyone. And when the show was over, instead of going to the after-parties, Eddie went back to his hotel room alone. What Lou Reed said to Eddie Van Halen in that hallway in 1984 didn't just ruin one night. It planted a seed of doubt that grew and grew over the following 2 decades. People close to Eddie noticed the change. He became obsessed with trying to write more meaningful songs, with proving that he wasn't just a technical player. The 1986 album 5150 showed Eddie trying to be more than just flashy solos. He started experimenting with synthesizers, with different textures, trying to find depth in his music. But the shadow of Lou's words followed him. In interviews throughout the late 80s and 90s, Eddie would occasionally bring up the idea that technique wasn't everything. That feeling mattered more than speed. Friends recognized this as Eddie wrestling with what Lou had told him, still trying to process it, still trying to prove it wrong, or prove it right, or maybe just prove something to himself. There were nights, according to people who toured with Van Halen, when Eddie would get drunk and start ranting about Lou Reed. Sometimes he would defend himself, talking about how many people his playing had inspired, how many guitarists had picked up the instrument because of him. Other times, he would agree with Lou, saying that he had wasted his talent on circus tricks and spectacle. The inconsistency itself was telling. Eddie couldn't settle on how he felt about Lou's assessment, because part of him knew it contained a grain of truth, even if that truth was painful and maybe unfair. The drugs and alcohol that would plague Eddie's life in the 90s and 2000s were fueled by many demons, but those who knew him well said that the encounter with Lou Reed was one of them. Eddie had always been insecure beneath the bravado, had always felt like he was proving something, and Lou had identified that insecurity with surgical precision and driven a knife directly into it. The fact that Lou had been right about Eddie trying to prove something to his father made it even worse. How had Lou known that? How had he seen through Eddie so completely in just a few minutes of conversation? In February of 2020, just months before Eddie Van Halen would die from throat cancer, he gave what would be his final interview to a trusted journalist. Eddie knew he was dying. He knew this was his last chance to say the things he had been carrying around for decades, and one of the things he wanted to talk about was Lou Reed, who had died in 2013, 7 years earlier. Eddie brought it up unprompted. He told the story of the 1984 MTV Awards, the Backstage confrontation, and what Lou had said to him. And then Eddie said something that shocked everyone who heard it. Lou was right, Eddie said. He was an asshole, and he said it in the cruelest way possible, but he was right. I spent my whole career trying to prove I was the best guitarist in the world. And for what? So people would clap? So magazines would put me on lists? Lou didn't care about any of that shit. He cared about making art that mattered, that said something true about being alive, even if it was ugly and dark and uncomfortable. I made people happy. I made them jump around and feel good, and that's fine, that's valuable, but it's not the same thing. When I'm gone, people will remember my solos, but will they remember anything I actually had to say? I don't know. I really don't know. The journalist asked Eddie if he regretted his career, if he wished he had done things differently. Eddie shook his head. I don't regret anything, he said. I did what I was supposed to do. I was the best at what I did. But Lou forced me to ask myself if what I did actually mattered. And I've been trying to answer that question for 20 years. I still don't have an answer. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the question is the answer. Eddie also revealed something else in that interview that almost nobody knew. In 2013, when Lou Reed died, Eddie had tried to reach out to Lou's widow, Laurie Anderson. He had written a letter trying to explain what Lou's words had meant to him, how they had shaped his life and his music, how he had carried them for so long. He wanted to thank Lou, even though thanking someone for the most painful truth of your life seemed absurd. Laurie never responded. Eddie didn't blame her. He understood. The story of Eddie Van Halen and Lou Reed backstage at the 1984 MTV Video Music Awards is more than just a tale of two egos clashing. It's a story about the eternal tension in rock music between virtuosity and authenticity, between technical mastery and emotional truth, between entertaining and meaning. Eddie represented one side of that divide: the pyrotechnics, the showmanship, the idea that rock and roll should make you feel alive and excited and powerful. Lou represented the other side: the darkness, the poetry, the idea that rock and roll should make you confront uncomfortable truths about yourself and the world. Neither man was entirely right, and neither was entirely wrong. Eddie Van Halen inspired millions of guitarists and brought joy to countless fans. His contributions to music are undeniable. But Lou Reed touched something deeper, something more primal and lasting. His music didn't make you happy. It made you feel, period. And in that hallway in 1984, Lou identified the one thing Eddie was most afraid of: that all his skill and speed and flash might be hiding an emptiness at the center. The tragedy is that Eddie never got to reconcile with Lou. They never had a follow-up conversation. Lou died in 2013 without ever knowing how profoundly his words had affected Eddie, how they had haunted him, shaped him, challenged him to be more than just a guitar hero. And Eddie died in 2020, still carrying the weight of that 7-minute interaction, still wondering if Lou had been right, still trying to prove something even as his body was failing him. In the end, what Lou Reed said to Eddie Van Halen was cruel, but not entirely unfair. Eddie did play like he was trying to prove something, because he was. And Lou did play like he had nothing left to prove, because he didn't. But the real revelation, the thing that took Eddie 20 years to understand, was that both approaches had value. The world needed Eddie's joy and technical brilliance just as much as it needed Lou's darkness and brutal honesty. The mistake wasn't in being one or the other. The mistake was in thinking you had to choose. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020, at the age of 65. In his final days, surrounded by family, he reportedly talked about Lou Reed again, about that night in 1984, about the words that had followed him like a ghost for 2 decades. And according to his son Wolfgang, Eddie finally made peace with it. Not because he decided Lou was wrong, and not because he decided Lou was right, but because he finally understood that the question itself, the struggle, the endless grappling with meaning and purpose and legacy, was what made him an artist in the first place. Lou Reed would have appreciated that. After all, Lou spent his entire career asking uncomfortable questions and refusing to provide easy answers. In his own twisted way, by destroying Eddie's ego that night in 1984, Lou gave Eddie the greatest gift one artist can give another: the gift of doubt, the gift of self-examination, the gift of knowing that being the best at something doesn't mean you've answered the only question that matters. What are you trying to say? And why does it matter? Eddie Van Halen spent 20 years trying to answer those questions, and in the end, maybe that struggle, that endless pursuit of meaning beyond technique, was his greatest solo of all.